Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from ASFX. I'm talking about the 2019 album by HÆLOS, Any Random Kindness. Alright, it's time to officially get into this next round of Patreon requests. So HÆLOS are a British indie pop trip-hop band, originally formed in 2014 by vocalists Lottie Bernadotte and Arthur Delaney and producer Dom Goldsmith, later bringing in a fourth member in Daniel Vildosola. And at some point in the last couple of years, which I haven't been able to confirm, I believe Arthur Delaney left the band to leave them a trio again. They really broke out in 2015 and 2016 after they signed to Matador Records and had minor hits in indie pop circles such as Dust or Prey. And that led them to eventually putting out a debut album in 2016 called Full Circle, which got a decent amount of attention at the time. Showed them setting down their particular style, which was described by critics of the time as sitting somewhere between the likes of Massive Attack, Moby, and The XX. Mildly gospel-infused, sultry indie pop with a male and female vocalists having some level of interplay with each other, mostly by way of just vocal harmonies over low-key instrumentals that are like a little rock, a little pop, a little electronic, but not really quite any of those. It got pretty well reviewed at the time as far as I can tell. In fact, the guy who requested this originally wanted me to focus this video on that debut album. However, when I listened to it myself and tried to start writing about it, I drew a complete blank. I have pretty much nothing to say about Full Circle at all. The entire project completely went in one ear and out the other. I've listened to it a couple times. I don't remember a single thing about it outside of kind of the general sound and vibe of the whole thing. Every track on there sounded exactly the same to me, and I will not remember any of it exists in record time. I mean, I didn't hate the experience by any means. It was just very 6 out of 10. The most 6 out of 10 thing I've ever heard, pretty much. Nothing to dislike, but absolutely nothing exemplary. The production is good, the lyrics are fine. I did get the feeling from their performances like they were all passionate about what they were doing in creating their style of dark euphoria or whatever. Maybe it's the kind of thing that would hit different for those who have like more of an indie rock taste that Matador typically markets to with their signees, like, you know, Perfume Genius, Spoon, Interpol, Algiers, Lucy Dacus, Pavement, and whatnot. Bands that would fall outside of my usual format and be better covered by people like, I don't know, Mike the Snare or ARTV or something. Or more likely, this band might be trying to appeal to the same crowd as outfits like Rufus Du Sol or Bob Moses, or maybe to a lesser extent Odessa, that, you know, also sat on that same line of commercial electronic and indie rock. But even with all that in mind, I'm also not surprised you don't really see many people still talking about HÆLOS these days. Much like the previous artist sent in to me by this particular requester, Man Without Country, they very much struck me as an opening act kind of band who you'll see introducing a more popular name. Maybe even a way more popular name, like how they recently opened for Depeche Mode of all people. And they were probably well liked by those who saw them. I wouldn't know myself, they were not opening on the date in the tour that I saw Depeche Mode. But there's not enough interesting to note about them as a band for them to like really feel like they could be headliners in their own right. As I'm sure will also be reflected in the fact that this video will most likely be tanking views-wise. Now, if the requester for this video had been like really dead set on me covering Full Circle and forced me to do the video on that album, this is the point at which the video would end. It'd be a video the size of like a Some Stuff I Miss segment, and it'd probably be something of an anticlimax that would not leave anyone satisfied. But thankfully the requester also gave me the alternative option to cover the band's only other studio album, and their only album as a four-piece outfit, their sophomore album from 2019, Any Random Kindness, if I happen to like that one more. Which I obviously did. And it frankly wasn't even close either. Their second album is leagues better than their debut. It didn't get as much attention as the debut as far as I can tell, presumably because it wasn't released on Matador, and thus they didn't have quite the same promotional budget anymore. And I'm not going to say it was such a huge improvement so as to become properly great, but you know what, it came closer to hitting that level than I expected. And there were two key departments where they improved which allowed this album to click so much better for me. For one thing, they got better at writing hooks that could much more easily stick in my mind. Their hook writing was serviceable before, but a bunch of these tracks have more of like an anthemic quality to them, where I was finding myself more likely to feel the urge to sing along with them, or at the very least, more easily remember the tune to them. Where on the debut, they all just kinda slipped into the background for me. But much more importantly than that, the band also decided to diversify their sound a bit more, resulting in an album where I can actually tell these tracks apart from each other. There's actually material here for me to write a regular-sized video around it, which is refreshing. Like, the project starts out really damn strong. The opener, Another Universe, starts out as this kind of spacey and almost like lo-fi ambient breakup ballad, but slowly starts to build up over time and bring in more extravagant string sections, and then by the end, Arthur Delany starts to come in as like a backup, and like he and Lottie Bernadotte, their voices are, they start layering over each other, and they create a really pretty and impressive sounding effect. I mean, this is still clearly the same band that was making those mildly gospel-infused trip-hop tracks that put them on the map a couple years prior, but there was more of an obvious emotional depth to a track like this than anything I'd heard from them on their debut, and it really stuck out to me in that way. And then we get all the project's most notable singles. First there's the lead single, Buried in the Sand, which brings in some more energy with some more organic percussion textures, thicker bass lines, and a lot of vocal harmonizing. It's the kind of track they'd done before plenty of times, but there is something strikingly catchy about it. Something oddly satisfying about the way the melodies from the verses lead into the chorus of them singing the title in a way that gets my attention. And then if that wasn't attention-grabbing enough, it's followed by a full-on classic 90s breakbeat track called End of World Party. Got those old-school It Takes Two shouting samples going up next to the moody pianos and the vocals, which take on a lot more of like an energetic soul R&B flavor. And they have all these call-and-response choruses. There's a level of life and energy put into this track that really stuck out to me in comparison with any of their other stuff. And it also makes for an interesting contrast for the more political edge to this track's lyrics. Like, they're basically doing the whole shake the shutter thing about, like, using music as a distraction from the ills of real life, and, like, they're zoning out and drowning out the headlines, but they're also throwing in lines like, we consume to medicate, or it's the children that we lose, trust your government, as a reminder that plugging your ears, or perhaps burying your head in the sand, as it were, isn't going to make the bad things go away. That whole somewhat social media-induced political theme is something that carries through the lyrics of several tracks on the album. They never have that much deep to say that wasn't being said by lots of other bands around that time. 2019 was a good time to be delivering those specific kinds of messages. But it is still something else interesting to note to show that they were trying to get more ambitious, and their heart was definitely always in the right place. Another good example of that is following track Kyoto, which is trying to deliver a similar message as it pertains to the environment. Lines about 3 degrees, rising seas, shut your ears and hope it goes away. But the main notable aspect of this track is the fact that it has probably the single most anthemic and catchy chorus out of any track in the bunch. Cherry blossom, it's the air that we breathe. That's some good shit. I also like the mildly wubbing bass drops the choruses lead into. Next we got Arc. I think that one's also got some kind of environmental or loose political message, albeit a much more vague one. And instrumentally, it's a much lower-key piano ballad with a few mildly jazzy drum breaks thrown in. I appreciated being here for the sake of adding more variety to the album sound, but it's not really as much of a standout as any of the previous 4 tracks. Certainly doesn't stick out in the same way as the next track, Boy/Girl, which has nothing to do with the similarly titled Aphex Twin track, but instead shows them moving in their most Massive Attack-inspired direction yet. Switching over to like this dark and gritty, almost hip-hop beat with the 2 lead vocalists trading off singing at each other in this lower register, which is the closest the band's come to rapping, I guess, although not in the cringe way, though. It reminds me of some of those grittier moments on Mezzanine. Maybe the angel in the fistfight line really stuck that comparison in my head. I may have gone on record as not being much of a big Massive Attack fan, but I do think the sound was really well executed here and sounded particularly cool, especially in this context where none of the other tracks here sound remotely like it. From there we move into more of the deeper cuts in the second half of the project, tracks like Deep State or Happy Sad, which don't have quite as sticky hooks and as such don't feel like, proper single material, but still provide a lot of cool instrumental textures. Definitely prefer the former of those, Deep State, as the quirky experimental broken beats build into this kind of big, airy dream pop atmosphere with warmer acoustic guitar strumming. Also, that track has a stronger tune between those two. Although Happy Sad's progressions through mildly organic UK garage-influenced beatwork and some rounder synth bass near the end is pretty neat too. That one's got a solid build-up to it. But in between those two tracks, we got Empty Skies, which might be my single favorite track on the album. If this album was taking cues from the likes of Massive Attack's Blue Lines, this track is their equivalent to Unfinished Sympathy. Lottie Bernardout is just putting the most, old 90s soul R&B singer affect into her voice, and is just going over this huge and spacious mix of synth pads and strings and breezy live drumming, and it just sounds so massively spirit-lifting. I mean, it's obviously not as good as Unfinished Sympathy. Massive Attack themselves never made another track within even the same ballpark of quality as that track, so there's no way I'd expect these guys to match it either, but the fact that the comparison is there at all, I think, speaks volumes. The last track on here that feels like it could be single material is penultimate track, So Long Goodbye. There's not really a unique sound to this track to set it apart from the rest of the track listing. It's got the same mix of live drums, electronic drums, moody pianos, big gospel-tinged choruses. But once again, the hook and melody that everything is built around is more than strong enough to carry the whole track on its own. Has that same big anthemic quality to it that Kyoto did. Far from you. This feels like it could make the perfect track to, close out their live sets or even be the perfect closer to this album. Although they still stick in one last track at the end as an encore of sorts. Last one out, Turn the Lights Off. It's a much lower key stripped back track again, maybe the most stripped back cut here, with Arthur Delaney stepping up in the lead to provide his much more naked indie rock vocals without any backup or harmonies or anything, going over a really simple instrumental of piano and light live drumming. I don't think this track works for as good a closer as the track it comes right after, but at the same time it wouldn't work as well if it were placed literally anywhere else on the album. Also, that's the track where the album title gets dropped, so it's clearly meant to be something important in context of the album. I mean, it's not a favorite, but it works well enough as a finisher. So yeah, that's everything on Any Random Kindness. Really dang solid album, I have to say. I'm not gonna say I absolutely love it as a whole. There are definitely tracks I liked much more than others, and it didn't do much to buck my perception of them as an opening act kind of band. I still wouldn't say they have that unique a sound in the greater context of this scene. They still have something of a tendency to wear their influences on their sleeve. And it's also not the kind of project that necessarily, leaves me itching to go back and put it back on right after I'm done or anything. The album's just under an hour long. While that's hardly overstuffed by any stretch, it's also not as tight as it possibly could be, I guess. I can't go as far as to say this would have stood out enough to me in 2019 to the point of becoming, a retrospective year endless contender or anything like that. But it did have several individual moments of greatness. Another Universe, End of World Party, Empty Skies, So Long Goodbye, etc. And there weren't any outright skips in the track listing either. Even the worst cuts here were at least pretty good. I basically had the same reaction to this that I remember having to the Cinematic Orchestra's last album from that same year. Really similar sound to that one as well, if I recall correctly. And like I said, coming off from how little of an impression their debut left on me, this was clearly leaps and bounds above that. I don't know if I'm sold enough on HÆLOS as a band where I would say this made me an active fan, but I was more than impressed enough by it to give my recommendation for any fans of indie pop or indie electronic of this particular style. It's really good, and I'm feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.